Friday the 13th. The Legend of Jason Voorhees. Written by Chase Farmer. Part 2. Camp Blood. The 5 young campers arrived at the formal Camp Crystal Lake entrance gate on the road. They decided to leave the car parked a little ways down from the gate before they grabbed all their camping supplies and began to walk down the rest of the road. John and Sam walked by each other's side in the front while Jake and Sierra followed behind, and Brendan staggered by himself in the back of the group. "So I was thinking maybe we should explore the old cabins. Maybe we'll see something crazy," suggested Jake. "Screw that. I'm not going to go wander around in those filthy old murder cabins, but you guys have a blast," Sam said. "What about you, babe?" Jake asked. "Sure, kind of sounds fun actually," Sierra replied. "Can I tag along with you guys?" Brendan asked. No, Brendan, I think we'll go alone," Jake said as he chuckled. John and Sam laughed under their breath, and Brendan muttered to himself, "Assholes." The group reached one of many camp spots, and Sam and John began to set up their tent. Jake and Sierra decided to go and explore the nearby abandoned cabins before doing anything else. Brendan set up his own tent and began to play headbanging rock music on his stereo at full blast volume. John broke out the beer and they all began to drink, light up stinky reefer, and build a fire as Turn Up the Radio by Autograph played on the mobile battery-powered boombox. Later that day, Tommy, Derrick, and Ted finally reached the Jarvis residence where they went into the barn in order to avoid grumpy old Mr. Jarvis. Derrick turned on his stereo and sat down in a chair in front of the barn next to Ted, who sat in another chair. Tommy ran inside to get them beers, as commanded by his big brother. When he went inside, he noticed his father was passed out drunk on the recliner chair in the living room, with football playing on the TV. Tommy filled his arms with as many beers as he could for Derrick and Ted. He returned out to the barn with all the beer he could carry, and Derrick and Ted began to crack them open. Derrick told stories about when he was in prison. He also told the story of why he ended up there in the first place. Derrick was involved with a violent street gang in the nearby town. He was arrested for trying to rob a liquor store with a gun after he got shot with a shotgun burst from the store clerk. He spent 3 years in prison for armed robbery and just recently got released to live with his younger brother and father on parole. The stories carried on for several minutes while a mix of popular 80s rock blasted on the radio. "You guys, I was being serious earlier. I saw Jason. I guess it could have been anyone. I only saw the person's hand, but there was definitely someone out there in the camp." Derrick and Ted looked at each other, both sharing the same buzz from the past 30 minutes of drinking beer and kicking back in the old, nearly busted lawn chairs. "Fuck it, let's go check it out. But if Dad asks where we went, tell him we took you to the store to buy a comic book or some shit," Derrick said as he rose from his chair and finished off his beer. "Okay, got it," Tommy jumped up. Ted stood up and said, "All right, let's do it. Maybe we'll see some old bum camping out there or something." The three took off and began walking towards Camp Blood. Meanwhile, Jake and Sierra reached the old cabins and began to explore. The place was dead silent. The sun was beginning to set. The sky was growing more dark as the couple entered the first cabin. When they entered, they saw the old beds covered in dirt and fallen leaves. The walls were falling apart and the roof was caving in. Every cabin was sure to look like this. "Jesus, can you believe all those kids got murdered here 20 years ago?" Jake asked as he slowly glanced around the dusty old cabin. "Yeah, I'm aware. You don't have to keep reminding me," Sierra said. "I'm going to go check out the other cabin," Jake shouted as he took off out the door and ran to the other cabin like a child. "Jesus," Sierra muttered to herself. Jake entered the second cabin, and it appeared to be the old counselor's HQ. There was a big desk and a couple offices that had several random stacks of paper and old moldy food scattered everywhere. Jake spotted a rat run into one of the rooms, and it made him jump a little bit. After the shock, he chuckled to himself, knowing it was just a silly rat. The cabin was terribly silent until Jake heard the floorboards creak in the same room the rat ran into. Suddenly, Jake grew uneasy when he faintly heard ch-ch-ch-ch Sierra, are you in here? A long, silent pause infested the cabin. How'd you beat me in here? Jake jokingly asked when he walked towards the room. He stopped before looking through the door when all of a sudden he heard a rat shrieking in dying agony. He moved into the doorway and a tall, burly man came out of the room and faced Jake. He had a filthy, former white, now brownish-colored sack over his head with a rope tied around the neck to keep it tight and one eye hole cut into it. He wore a mud-ridden, dark green button-up long-sleeve shirt with dusty, dark gray pants. In his left hand was the whimpering rat. The man had his thumb jammed into the rodent's neck, causing blood to squirt everywhere. "Holy shit, Sierra!" Jake shouted as he turned around and made a run for the front door. He didn't make it far before the man grabbed him from the back of the shirt, causing Jake to choke himself accidentally with his own collar. The man snatched a handful of Jake's hair up and began to burrow his face into the old wooden wall. Jake tried to scream and get away, but after the second hit to the wall, he began to lose consciousness. The man only slammed Jake's head harder and harder. Blood was coating the air and painting the wall along with the mysterious man's hand. He finally dropped Jake to the ground and stomped his head in like a pumpkin with one single attempt. At the same time, Sierra reached the front doorway of the cabin and saw the tall monster standing over Jake's dead body. She shrieked as loud as possible before running off into the woods with no direction at all. She just wanted to get away from the man, but he followed her. Although he never ran, he just walked very fast and aggressively. He was the most terrifying person Sierra had ever seen, and the creepy sack over his head only made it worse. Her adrenaline kicked in and she ran at the speed of light. Eventually, she lost her pursuer, but she couldn't keep her emotions together. She had just seen her boyfriend lying dead on the floor in the middle of a strange cabin. She was lost in the middle of the forest by herself at this point. Never had she been this scared and out of breath. Then she heard, ch-ch-ch-ch. The sound stuck with the wind and blew through the trees as she froze up in shock. Sierra began to tiptoe backwards slowly when her back was poked lightly by a broken tree branch. Before Sierra caught her breath, the man suddenly appeared before her, covered in blood and charging at her. She went to move out of the way, but he was just too fast. He grabbed her by both shoulders and pushed her into the tree branch that was poking her back. It exploded out of her chest and blood sprayed all over the man's shirt and sack mask. It began to pour out of the girl's mouth as her eyes rolled into the back of her head. The man stepped back to take a look at his kill and tilted his head off to the side. The sun had set completely. The night arrived at last. The man looked at the lake in the distance, and he heard a voice say to him, "Kill them all for Mommy, Jason. Kill them all." To be continued.